Alright, today's lesson, we're going to be able to describe how African empires were connected to European and Asian empires that we've been studying in the last few units. So before we can start talking about these different African civilizations, let's talk about the background of Africa itself. And I do have to mention that this is unfortunately a shorter unit just because it bumps up against the end of the semester, and so we do have to kind of wrap things up rather quickly here. I fully admit that I'm not giving these African empires the entirety of what they deserve as far as time in class and what we're going to be talking about. I do encourage you to dig further in, and depending on what year you're listening to this, there may or may not be an extra credit project involved in this as well. And if I don't offer the extra credit project in this unit or whatever semester or year you're taking this, ask. Maybe I'll consider it. Timeline wise, we're going to be backtracking throughout some of the history we've already been talking about to see what was going on in Africa during these times. However, for the most part, we're going to be talking about this period here, like the 3rd century Common Era through about the 15th century. So that's about a 1200-year span, and that's essentially what's going on in Africa during the time when the Roman Empire is splintering and falling apart. The Islamic Caliphate is on its rise. It goes into its Islamic civilization goes into its golden age. The East-West Schism is going on, as well as the Crusades, which we haven't quite gotten to yet. So essentially, this Africa mini unit is going to be both going back in time to cover periods that we've already talked about and see what's going on in Africa, as well as looking forward in time into periods that we won't have yet gotten into when discussing the Middle East and Europe, which we'll be getting to in second semester. So a nice little bridge mini unit right here at the end of first semester. The continent of Africa is massive and diverse, both culturally and geographically. So there's a lot of different cultures that are thriving and civilizations that are rising and falling across the African continent during all the periods that we've been talking about. We just really haven't mentioned them much, or at least not directly. The north of Africa is dominated by the Sahara Desert, the world's largest hot desert in the world, and it kind of serves as a barrier between the Mediterranean world that we've been talking about and then the worlds of Africa that are below that are connected to this Mediterranean world up here, but still kept separate because of this large desert. The center here, right along the equator, is actually covered by a vast rainforest, so the complete opposite of the Sahara Desert. Then at the south here, you see there's also more deserts, like the Kalahari Desert, and you see in the rest of Africa is covered by this area known as the savanna, essentially a vast grasslands area. So you can see Africa has a lot going on. Human civilization wise, it is filled with small kingdoms that have been rising and falling throughout the histories that we've been talking about. Now, because of this class is only 1 year long, we don't really have time to talk about all these different civilizations. We're only going to be talking about a select few of them. And the fact is that there is a lack of information about a large of these due to several reasons. First and foremost, there aren't a lot of written records because most of these civilizations never developed an independent writing system. Instead, especially over here in the West, they passed a lot of their information on orally, that is, by spoken word. So there's a lack of written information that we can go back and look at to learn about the histories of these cultures. And the oral tradition, the oral memory being passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth, well, there's going to be a big event that's going to pop up soon that's going to drastically wipe out large populations in Africa, known as the Atlantic slave trade, and that plays a kind of a big role in some of this history being lost as well. Another big reason is when Europeans eventually start colonizing this area in the 19th century, jumping way forward into our timeline, many of these historical sites will be destroyed as well. So we're getting more information now as archaeologists and historians are digging further into this past, but we just don't have the quite depth of information that we do have, say, about the Romans, the Greeks, or the Islamic Caliphate, for instance. Now, what's also important to know is these kingdoms and empires of Africa are also very much interconnected with the trade routes that extend all the way to the east to China and India, both by land across the Silk Road and by sea in this trade route that I like to refer to as the monsoon marketplace. So, this African world, well divided and separated by the Sahara Desert, is still connected to this wider world via the trade networks that we've been studying this whole time. So, the Sahara Desert is really kind of this integral feature in northern Africa that serves a very important role. In the north, it becomes this difficult barrier that's hard to cross and keeps armies from kind of marching across, invading, and conquering these lower territories. In the north of the Sahara Desert, you do have these civilizations that are eventually conquered and integrated into the Roman Empire first, then later the Macedonian Empire, Alexander the Great, but only, of course, this part right here over in Egypt, and then the Islamic Caliphate, which spread all the way across northern Africa as well. So, for the most part, the Sahara Desert insulates these sub Saharan cultures and separates them from the rest of the world that we've been studying. However, as I mentioned, it's not completely insulated from the rest of the world, as trade networks will cross the Sahara Desert in order to interconnect these cultures over here with the cultures of Arabia, as well as the Middle East, all the way into Europe, and even all the way east to China and India. That means for the right resources, merchants were willing to risk the dangers of the Sahara Desert. We're also going to be seeing in later lessons how merchants are going to cross the Indian Ocean from India, Arabia, even as far east as China to come over to trade with the east coast cultures of Africa, but that's another lesson that we're going to get to. So if you pause and take a look at this map, what resources appear to be the most plentiful in Western Africa? Go ahead, take a minute and see for yourself. If you said gold and salt, well, then you would be correct. Gold and salt become the dominant resources of Western Africa that other cultures want access to. Now, they have other resources as well. As you can see, unfortunately, slavery is a big part of this, as indicated by these chains here. But gold and salt become the dominant resources that are part of this trade network that interconnects them up into the Mediterranean Sea, which will then all the way to Alexandria, which then connects with the Silk Road that will go all the way east. So gold and salt become the prominent resources. Now take a moment and ask yourself, why would this city right here, the city of Ghat, be such an important location along these trade routes? If you said, well, it seems to be about halfway across the Sahara Desert, so it's a good stopping point, you'd be absolutely correct. It's in an oasis location that people are able, merchants who are traveling across the desert, can stop at to refuel to get resources in order to not get lost in the middle of the desert and find their way over to Western Africa where all the gold is. Finally, why would you think this city right here, Timbuktu, would be such an important location? Timbuktu is the first major city that you're going to arrive in once you get through the Sahara Desert, and it's located at the northernmost point of the Niger River. And this is kind of an important location because, again, once you're getting out of the desert, it is a place that you can stop at and refuel, but also trade for the resources of the lands that are further south, or namely all the gold that's down here. You'll notice it's long river routes, which means people can ship the gold and other resources up the Niger River to Timbuktu and then trade it for the resources that are coming across the Sahara Desert and vice versa. So it's really the gateway to southwestern Africa. The merchants that traveled west along these routes across the Sahara Desert, they were coming with resources from China and India, like cloth and spices, with Muslim merchants crossing with high quality weapons that were being produced in the Arabian Peninsula as well. When they got across, it's salt and gold they're looking for. Now, it is the kings of this area that are going to be controlling these trade routes because if you control a trade route and merchants are coming and going, buying and selling, you're able to tax those sales, and that's going to bring in a lot of money for your culture. And that's kind of what fuels the economy and the empires of Western Africa, this gold salt trade that connects it all the way to the Silk Road and the monsoon marketplace. Now, why salt? Why is that such a big deal? Well, first and foremost, the Sahara Desert used to be a giant inland saltwater body, right? It was like the Mediterranean Sea, but salt water. And so when that dried up when the climate changed, the water disappeared, but the salt was left behind below all the sands. And salt is crucial for stopping meat from spoiling without refrigeration. And so, in a time period before you could refrigerate anything to keep things from going bad, you need to pack it with a lot of salt. A stable salt supply is going to result in a stable food supply, which will result in a stable civilization. A much more detailed version of this history and why the salt is so important can be found in this bestseller book called Salt, A World History, which, yes, I own and have read. It was a gift to me from my wife a few years ago. Tells the history of the world from the perspective of the salt trade, and your mind would be blown about how important salt is to human history. So, yes, people would risk crossing the Sahara Desert in order to get access to these vast salt mines. So that's why people would risk their lives for this salt that's over here in Western Africa. But why gold? Honestly, the simple answer is because it's shiny, and that's pretty much it. Okay, it goes a little deeper. Gold is shiny. There's not a lot of it, which means not, and that means not everyone can have it. And it also doesn't rust and deteriorate like other metals, which means it's good for using for currency. That's pretty much it. And is the reason people will kill each other en masse in order to get access to it. All right, that's the background. Let's talk about the rise and fall of West African empires, because there are several of note that we really should be paying attention to. The three empires that we're going to be looking at in this lesson, at least, are Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, which all kind of develop around the same area of Western Africa here over different periods of time. So Ghana develops around 1000 Common Era, Mali 1400 Common Era, and Songhai around 1500 Common Era. So Ghana kind of develops around the same time that the Crusades are about to kick off. The Great Schism happens that we learned about in the Byzantine Empire. And so it's kind of at the edge of where we are in world history up to this point. Mali will develop after that, and then Songhai will be even closer into modern day. All three of these empires were able to grow in power and prominence because of their control of this gold salt trade route. Let's start with the earliest one, Ghana. So by around the year 800 Common Era, the gold salt trade made it a very, very rich empire, and the kings of this area were able to use all that wealth generated from not only the gold mines found in this region, but also the taxes generated from the gold salt trade route in order to pay for large armies to control their neighboring territories. And the kings of this empire were spectacularly wealthy. For reference, this is not too long, within a century of Islam becoming a religion, so that's kind of where we are timeline wise. By the 11th century, that's about the 1000s, the kings of this territory have converted to the religion of Islam as the Arabic merchants who are traveling across the gold salt trade route across the Sahara are bringing the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad with them. The kings convert because they find it useful in order to have access to these traders and get better deals. And so many of the kings will convert to Islam, while the people of their empires generally tend to still worship traditional animist beliefs. However, shortly after this conversion, only within about a century or two, they are conquered by another North African Islamic culture known as the Almoravids and then later the Almohads. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you go into too much detail on that. But essentially, so this is where the Empire of Ghana was, and the Almoravids, essentially from North Africa up here, Morocco region, came down across the west coast and conquered the territory, the Empire of Ghana, and that was the end of the Empire of Ghana. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, but weren't they both Muslim? Yes, so they shouldn't fight each other. Correct. But they did? Absolutely. This is a classic example of where people's political ambition overrides their religious beliefs. By 1235 Common Era, these North Africans were overthrown by King Sundiata, also known as the Lion King of West Africa. Yep, not the Lion King is in Disney, but the actual Lion King. And it's from Sundiata that we get the Empire of Mali. Sundiata uses the wealth from this gold salt trade route to create a golden age in West Africa. And like previous rulers of the Empire of Ghana, Sundiata and his descendants are also converts to Islam, making this part of the larger Islamic caliphate or community. Now, commoners were also a mix of Muslims, but also many of them, again, still follow the animist faiths of their ancestors. That is the worship of tree spirits, rock spirits, water spirits, essentially the idea that everything has a spirit and everything is equal. This is where we enter Mansa Musa, the wealthiest man to have ever existed until very, very recently. And by very recently, I mean Elon Musk. But that's enough of modern history. Mansa Musa expanded the size of the Mali Empire, so conquering new territories, but is probably the most famous for his Hajj to Mecca. You remember, the Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of Islam that all good Muslims must do. Once in their life, if they're financially capable and healthy enough, they must make a trip to Mecca to rewalk in the steps of Muhammad, and who is rewalking in the steps of the Prophet Abraham. And as a good Muslim, as he traveled east to Mecca, he saw many, many people who were less wealthy than himself. And one of the other core tenets of Islam was to help those in need, to give alms. And so on this trip, he's remembered as giving away so much gold that its value actually dropped for months to years after he passed through the area, because he gave away so much gold to the people there that it actually lost value. There's just too much gold. When he returned to Timbuktu, he then spent more of that wealth to build mosques, so places of worship for the Muslims in his territory, as well as universities in his capital city of Timbuktu to help spread Islam. It is why Timbuktu became a center of learning and culture in Africa, as well as one of the most prominent places for learning in the world. We're going to take a deeper look at Timbuktu in a later lesson. But it is because of this Hajj he created stronger connections between West Africa and the Middle East. And while Timbuktu becomes the center of learning and wealth in the world, it also kind of creates a problem for our African cultures. It's because as Mansa Musa is traveling through this area right here in Egypt, he's giving away a lot of gold, and that catches the eye of some of the European merchants who are kind of visiting in this area. The European merchants become obsessed with this idea that there's some mythical magical source of wealth somewhere in Africa that they become dead set obsessed with finding for the next couple of centuries. This will eventually lead to the Age of Exploration, as well as, unfortunately, the transatlantic slave trade, which absolutely decimates the African continent. But just like all empires, Mansa Musa's empire eventually falls. So Mansa Musa's successors were not exactly as great of rulers as him. You can't always say that the children are going to be as good as their parents. So the trade route shifts further east as some of these gold mines are kind of mined out, and there becomes more kind of to the east of it here, and that becomes the center of trade. This leads to the rise of a new empire known as the Songhai Empire, which lasted from 464 Common Era until about 1591. It doesn't last very long because civil war and invasion from North Africans who are coming down with, well, early guns they've gotten from Europeans ends about 1,000 years of powerful West African empires. This also happens around the same time that the Atlantic slave trade is starting up, which further weakens these territories. We'll get into that in a lot more detail in second semester. However, I think it's important to take this moment to learn that these powerful and important cultures did exist in this area before any of that happens. So that's why we're taking a little time to study this. So first and foremost, why do we need to learn all of this? And that's because Africa has this long and rich history of civilizations that gets overlooked a lot of time. Many Americans, when they think of Africa, they don't think there was any civilization there. They think, oh, civilization, Rome, Greece, maybe Mesopotamia, but they don't, Egypt, which they don't always consider part of Africa, which blows my mind that people would think that Egypt's not part of Africa. People also tend in America to think of Africa as this very poor continent, but in actuality, it is a resource rich continent. Whether it's gold, whether it's diamonds, whether it's rare earth elements necessary to make our microchips today, it is an extremely wealthy continent. But then you might be wondering, well, Mr. Dunbeck, if it's such a wealthy continent in terms of resources, why is it seen as so poor today? That's a question I'm going to leave you with, but we are going to come back to that when we get to later in the second semester, when we get to the 19th century and the scramble for Africa, as European empires turn away from their conquest in the New World and start looking at Africa to divide it amongst themselves. But again, we're going to leave that story strand hanging until we come back to this region in second semester. It's also important to know all this because those trade routes and resources are going to make it that target for European colonizers and are soon to play a central role in history that we're telling. As always, rewrite the goal on your note sheet. Identify those 3 important facts using complete thoughts, complete sentences that show you understand what we're talking about. And then, at the very least, write one question you have. Think about what you learned. Take a moment to let it integrate into your brain, and then come up with a question that you type out on the note sheet, and I will respond to it. This will help you actually remember it and integrate this knowledge into the knowledge you've already acquired. All right, until then, we'll see you next class.